The goats found it on a Tuesday morning, in the 6th week of the worst summer anyone in the valley could remember. She was standing halfway up the hillside when the lead doe stopped pulling at the vines and started pawing instead, scraping at something underneath the last thick curtain of green, something solid and cut and deliberately placed. The sound was wrong for hillside rock, too flat, too purposeful. She heard it from 20 feet away, and she started moving before she understood why. But to understand what she was looking at that morning, you have to go back to the first morning, the auction morning, the one that started everything. It was a Thursday in early June, and the air already had that hard, bright quality that comes before a drought settles in to stay. The county auctioneer was standing on the back of a flatbed truck outside the old grain office, running through parcels that nobody wanted. Most of the crowd had already turned away from the listing he'd just announced. 44 acres on the eastern ridge, choked solid with kudzu vine from the fence line to the crown of the hill, uncleared, unworked, untouched for longer than anyone could say. She was standing at the back of the crowd with $9 in her coat pocket. That was the whole of it. $9 and a dairy that was already struggling on flat valley ground that got good water in a good year. But this was not shaping up to be a good year. She had walked the base of that hillside in April, when the kudzu was still low enough to see through. She had noticed things. The way the green was different near the middle slope, darker, colder somehow, even in spring warmth. The way her lead doe, walking the fence line with her that day, had pressed her nose against the hill and pulled long breaths in through her nostrils, the way goats do when water is somewhere underneath. She had filed that away. She had thought about it on slow milking mornings, and on nights when the creek ran lower than it should. She had thought about it the way poor people think about long chances, carefully, quietly, without telling anyone, because the only thing worse than a long chance failing is letting other people watch it fail. The auctioneer called the lot. Nobody moved. She raised her hand. The bid opened at $9. Which was the minimum the county would accept for land they'd been trying to unload for 3 seasons. Nobody countered. There was a pause, the kind that stretches just long enough for people to look around and find out whose hand it was. When they found her, young, slight, dairy mud still on her boots, the laughter started low and spread the way laughter does in a crowd that feels safe making it. The auctioneer brought the gavel down. 44 acres, $9, hers. She walked to the table, signed her name, and did not look at any of the faces turned toward her. She folded the deed once, placed it inside her coat, and walked out of the auction yard into the full white heat of the morning. The laughter followed her a few steps and then stopped, the way laughter does when the person it's aimed at refuses to carry it. The drive back was short. Her truck was old enough that she could feel every rut in the county road through the soles of her boots on the floorboards. She passed the feed store, past the grain co-op, past the long flat stretch of her neighbor's cornfield already showing the first pale curl at the leaf tips that meant the soil was starting to beg. The drought had not been named yet. People were still calling it a dry spell, the way they call things by smaller names when they're hoping the smaller name will make them smaller. But she had watched her creek all spring, and she knew the difference between a dry spell and something that meant real trouble. She turned up her lane and stopped the truck at the top of her own flat pasture, where the valley floor gave out and the hillside began. From here it looked exactly like what everyone at that auction had said it was, a wall of kudzu, green and dense and completely without shape, the vines layered so thick that nothing underneath showed through, no stone, no soil, no tree trunk, no telling what had been there before the vine took it. Other people looked at that hillside and saw the end of something. She looked at it and saw a surface. She got out of the truck and walked to the fence line where her pasture ended and the hill began. She pressed one hand flat against the outer vine wall. It was warm on the surface from the morning sun, but cooler an inch beneath, the way things are when there's mass behind them, when the growth is deep and layered, and the air inside it doesn't move. She could smell the green rot of old stems at the bottom, where years of vines had died back and composted against each other. Good goat smell, she thought. Good goat work. She turned and looked back at her herd. 22 dairy goats, small and angular and restless along the fence, because goats are always restless near something they haven't been allowed to reach yet. They had seen her walk to the hill. Several were already pressing their faces between the fence boards, nostrils working, reading the air coming off that slope. She had not told anyone her plan. Not because she was secretive by nature, but because the plan was simple enough that anyone could find a reason to mock it, and she had already used up her allowance of other people's mockery for one morning. The plan was this: goats eat what nothing else will touch. Kudzu was just a vine. A vine was just a plant. And a plant, given enough hungry animals and enough time, was a temporary thing. She went to do the evening milking. Tomorrow, she would open the gate. She opened the gate in the early morning, when the air was still cool and the dew made the kudzu leaves dark and heavy. The goats needed no encouragement. The one she privately thought of as the oldest, a gray-muzzled doe with one torn ear, went through first, and the rest followed in their particular restless way, already pulling at leaves before their back feet had cleared the post. She stood at the fence and watched. There is a specific sound a goat makes when it is working through something it genuinely wants. Not the frantic sound of an animal at a grain bucket, but something more patient and deliberate, a soft tearing, a chewing rhythm, a movement through dense material that is almost methodical. Within 10 minutes, the herd had spread itself across the lower edge of the slope in a loose line, each animal pulling downward on whatever vine was nearest, stripping leaves in long, dragging mouthfuls, moving slowly uphill. The kudzu fought back the only way it knew how, which was by volume. For every stem a goat pulled loose, 3 others fell across its back. The vines were tangled at their roots in a way that meant nothing came free cleanly. They came in long ropes, dragging other stems, pulling up brittle dead growth from the previous seasons underneath. The hillside shook in small, slow sections when a root finally gave. She watched until she was certain the herd had settled into the work, then went back to do the morning milking. Her 4 remaining dairy animals, 2 older does near the end of their production cycle, 2 younger ones still building, stood waiting in the barn with the patience of animals that have learned patience from routine. She milked by hand, as she always did, and set the pails to cool in the root cellar under the house. The morning paper lay folded on the fence post where the neighbor boy had thrown it. She did not open it. She had been avoiding news about the drought because the drought was not going to improve because she read about it. What she knew already was enough. The creek at the bottom of the valley was half its usual width. The grass in the low pasture had started going gray at the tips. Her milk yield had dropped 9 days ago, which she had noted without comment in the small ledger she kept nailed above the barn door. The afternoon turned fierce. The kind of heat that doesn't move, that sits on a hillside like a weight. She brought the herd fresh water from the hand pump, carrying it in 2 buckets. The water cost her effort and time, but she had both of those. What she did not have was a solution to the summer being what it was, and the creek being what it was becoming. She looked up the hill at the end of the day. The goats had eaten a clear band across the lower third of the slope. Beneath their work, pale stone showed through in patches, long slabs of gray and cream, still warm from the sun. She looked at the stone a moment longer than she needed to. She went to bed thinking about the stone. Not the goats, not the cheese, not anything she could name or plan toward. Just the stone itself, the way it had caught the last of the light, the pale gray slabs running horizontal through the hillside like they had been laid there by someone with a purpose. Natural stone runs in its own directions. It follows water, pressure, time. What she had seen in those exposed patches ran too flat, too even. She turned that thought over in the dark, the way you turn a coin in your pocket, not looking at it, just knowing it's there. She was up before first light. The goats were already moving when she came to the pen gate, pressing against it in the gray dark, ears forward. They knew the hill now. They had decided it was theirs. She let them through and followed them up the slope in the cool of the early morning, which was the only mercy the day offered anymore, before the heat took over and made the world feel like something being slowly pressed flat. The band they had cleared the day before looked wider in the morning, cleaner. The vines that remained above it were dense and tangled as ever, the kudzu doing its patient, relentless work even in drought, even in heat that was killing off other things. But where the goats had been, the hillside had a different character. There was actual slope visible. There was stone, there was the sense of land underneath all of it, real and solid and old. She walked the edge of the cleared band slowly, the way she walked a fence line when she was looking for a weak post. Methodical, unhurried, one foot placed, then the next. Here the stone face ran in a long, low shelf. There a narrow gully cut down through it, where old rains had traced a path. She ran her hand along one of the exposed slabs and felt the texture of it, rough at the edges, almost smooth in the middle where something had worn it. Weather, she thought, or water. The kind of wearing that takes a long time. The goats pushed into the vines above her, pulling long green ropes of kudzu down off the face of the hill with a sound like tearing cloth. They were methodical in their own way. They worked from hunger, not intention, but the result was the same. She stopped at a place where the exposed stone seemed to jut outward slightly, a low overhang, maybe 3 feet above the ground. The vines here were particularly thick, not sprawling out across the slope, but packed tight against the stone, almost vertical, matted and heavy, like something had grown against a surface and been encouraged to cover it. She reached in and pulled a handful of kudzu away from the face of the hill. The stone behind it was cut, not broken, not natural, cut square, with a seam running vertical from just above her knee to well above her head, framed in dressed gray rock, the edges still sharp under the green tangle. She stood very still and looked at it. Her fingers traced the vertical seam. It ran clean and deliberate, cut by someone who knew what they were doing, who had a reason to do it carefully. Stone like this did not happen by accident. Someone had shaped it, fitted it, framed it in dressed rock the way you frame a door, because that is exactly what it was. A door. The word moved through her slowly, the way cold water moves through a warm room. Not a natural outcrop, not a ledge. A threshold, buried under 30 or 40 years of kudzu, sealed by the weight of vines and time, and the forgetting that follows when people leave a place and do not come back. She pulled more vines away with both hands. They came in long, tearing sheets, roots snapping where they had anchored into the mortar between stones. The goats heard the sound, and 2 of them pushed closer, curious, pulling at the loose tendrils she dropped behind her. The hill had the smell of something finally opened, damp earth and green sap, and underneath it, something cooler, something that did not belong to summer at all. She worked her way down the seam to the ground. At the base, wedged between the stone frame and the hillside soil, was what remained of a wooden door. The wood had rotted almost entirely back into the earth, gray and soft, more memory of wood than actual wood, but its shape was still legible. Horizontal planks, wide ones, fitted together the old way. The iron hinges had held better than the wood itself, still bolted to the stone frame on the left side, dark brown with rust but solid. The door itself had simply collapsed inward at some point, falling away from the hinges, and the kudzu had grown over it and pressed it down, and eventually buried it where it lay. She crouched low and looked into the gap where the door had been. The air that came out was not summer air. It was cold in a way that stopped her, not the cold of shade or a root cellar dug a few feet into a hillside, but a deeper cold, a cold with weight behind it, the kind that means moving water somewhere close. It washed over her face, and she stayed very still and let it. Dark inside, She could see nothing yet. Only the shape of the opening, roughly rectangular, taller than wide, the stone frame solid on three sides. She pulled the last mat of vines away from the top of the frame. Light touched the interior just enough to show her a floor of flat stone, and a ceiling of fitted rock overhead, and walls that went back further than the light reached. One of the goats pressed its head against her shoulder, impatient, wanting what she was blocking. She put her hand out and held it back gently. She needed light. She needed to see what was in there before the goats went in and made that impossible. She stood up and looked back down the hill toward her farm. She moved fast then. Down the hill, weaving between the goats that had scattered across the stripped slope, their hooves clicking on stone that had not seen daylight in longer than she could guess. The sun hit her full when she cleared the shade of the remaining vine tangles near the crest, and the heat of it after that cold breath from the doorway felt almost violent. She kept moving. The farm below looked small from up here. The dairy barn, the fence line, the dry brown patch where the pasture had given up weeks ago, a few of her goats still down there, the older ones she hadn't moved to the hill yet, standing pressed together near the empty trough, heads low. The sight of them made her chest tighten, and she moved faster. She went straight to the barn. There was a lantern hanging on the center post, the same one her neighbor had lent her at the start of the season, with the comment that at least she'd need it when she was stumbling around in the dark trying to figure out what she'd done wrong. She had not found that funny then. She took the lantern now, checked the oil, found it low, and went to the shelf above the feed bin where she kept a small tin of lamp oil. She poured it in slowly, not spilling any. She could not afford to spill any. She took the matches from beside the stove in the side room. She looked around the barn once, the way a person does when they are about to go somewhere and don't know exactly what they'll find when they return. The barn looked back at her, ordinary and sun-bleached and struggling. She went back up the hill. The goats had not gone in. They were clustered at the opening, pushing against each other, necks extended, nostrils going. The cold air was still coming out, and they wanted it the way they always wanted anything strange and unreachable. She moved through them, said nothing, struck the match at the top of the doorframe out of the wind, and touched it to the lantern wick. Light gathered, warm and small but enough. She stepped through the doorway. The cold closed around her the moment she was inside, and the sounds from outside went soft, as if the hillside had exhaled and drawn a breath. Her footsteps changed against the flat stone floor. The lantern swung gently, and the light moved across the walls, across the fitted stones, across the low ceiling, arching overhead where old soot marks ran in faint lines, from some fire or torch long extinguished. Then the light reached further back, and she saw them. They were stacked along the right-hand wall, round and pale and orderly, a row of them, and then another row stacked above, and another above that. Her breath came out slow. She moved toward them, lantern raised, and the smell reached her then, sharp and clean and aged, and she understood before she was close enough to touch the first one what she was looking at. She pressed her palm flat against the nearest wheel. The rind was dry and hard, almost like bark, and the cold of it moved straight through her hand. She turned it slightly on the shelf, and the stone beneath it scraped quiet and low. It held its shape. It had been here long enough to become sure of itself, settled and patient, the way old things get when no one has disturbed them. She counted along the bottom row with the lantern held close. 7, 8. She moved to the next section of wall and counted again. 11 more. She stepped deeper into the cave, past a gap in the shelving where the stone jutted out and formed a natural break. And on the other side of it, the rows continued. She stopped counting somewhere past 30 and simply stood with the light swaying and the cold pressing against the back of her neck, and the smell of aged milk and salt and time filling the whole low space around her. She had no frame for what this meant yet. Not fully. Her mind kept moving toward it and then pulling back, the way a person does when something is too large to look at straight on. Cheese, aged cheese. Dozens of wheels, stacked and waiting in a cave that had been sealed and forgotten, while the kudzu piled over the door, and the years stacked up above it like more weight on a shelf. She walked back toward the far wall to find the edge of the cave, and that was when she heard it. Not loud, barely anything really, a small, constant sound underneath the silence, steady and clean. She moved the lantern lower, and the light caught the floor, and she saw the dark thread of it moving along the base of the back wall, running in a narrow groove worn into the stone over what must have been a very long time. Water. Cold and clear and continuous, threading out from a crack in the base of the stone and moving along the channel and disappearing through a low gap at the side wall where it ran on somewhere further below. She crouched down and set the lantern to one side and dipped 2 fingers into the current. It was so cold it hurt. The kind of cold that means depth, that means the water has traveled a long way through the earth before it arrives anywhere near the surface. It wasn't a seep, it wasn't a puddle left from old rain. It was running. It had been running the whole time, underneath the sealed door, and the tangled vines and the decades of silence, running through the summer heat outside, without knowing anything about drought or dying grass or animals standing in dry lots, with their tongues going thick. She sat back on her heels and looked at the water moving past her hand, and then up at the cheese wheels lining the walls, and then back at the small bright opening of the cave entrance behind her, where the goats were still pulling at the hillside, and the sky beyond them had gone the deep pale color it gets just before the afternoon turns brutal. She stayed crouched there for a long moment, listening to the water. That was the thing about a running spring. It made a sound, a low, steady murmur that had no intention in it, no urgency, just continuation. It had been making that sound in the dark for years, maybe decades, with no one to hear it. And all summer long, while the valley dried out and the creek beds went white, and the farmers stood at their fences shaking their heads at cracked earth, this water had been here, right here, 40 feet above her barn. She picked up the lantern and walked the length of the cave slowly, holding it close to the walls. The spring entered along the back left corner through a seam in the stone, a natural fracture that leaked cold air along with the water. The channel it carved was shallow but clean, worn smooth over time, and it ran the full width of the cave floor before disappearing into that low gap in the far wall. The flow was steady, not a trickle, not something that would vanish in August, something that had been moving through limestone long enough to carve its own path. She touched the stone wall above the seam. It was wet and cold, even at shoulder height, sweating with the chill that came up from underground. She had piped water before, short runs of iron pipe from the well to the trough, nothing complicated. This was higher elevation than her barn. That meant gravity. That meant she would not need to pump it. She stood still for a moment, doing the calculation in her head, the way her father had taught her to think through a farm problem. Start from what you have and work toward what you need. She had a spring running clean and cold. She had a hillside. She had a barn below. She needed water enough to keep 12 dairy goats alive and producing through the worst summer anyone could remember. The numbers came out right. She turned and counted the cheese wheels again, moving the lantern shelf by shelf. She had counted 31 before, but in the far corner, low on the bottom shelf where the stone was darkest, she found 6 more she had missed in the first pass. 37 wheels in total. Some were small, the kind you'd age for a season and sell local. Others were the size of a wagon wheel hub, the long-aged kind that went hard and sharp and that buyers paid serious money for at county markets. She did not let herself think about the money yet. That was a habit she had learned young. Counting money before it was in your hand was how hope became disappointment. She just noted it. 37 wheels, viable spring, gravity slope, enough. She walked back to the entrance and stepped out into the heat. The goats had moved further along the hillside. The sky was white and flat above the ridge. One of the older does lifted her head and looked at her with calm yellow eyes. still chewing a mouthful of vine. She stood at the cave mouth for a long moment, letting her eyes adjust back to the white summer light. The heat hit her like a wall after the cool of the stone interior. She could feel the difference in temperature even 3 steps outside the entrance, the air around the doorframe carrying that faint, cold mineral smell of deep water and old rock. She needed pipe. That was the first practical thought that settled through everything else. She needed enough pipe to run a line from the spring down the hillside to her lower pasture, and she needed it before the herd showed real signs of stress. They were holding, but she had watched dairy goats long enough to know how fast holding could turn to failing when heat pressed down day after day without relief. She went over what she had. There was a length of old iron pipe coiled behind the barn, left from when the previous tenant had tried to run a water line to the far pen and given up halfway through. She had never thrown it out because she never threw anything out. There was more pipe in pieces under the feed room floor, where the boards had soft spots. She had noticed it months ago and made a mental note she hadn't acted on until now. People who didn't have money developed a certain kind of memory for abandoned materials. You logged them away and waited for the day the need matched the supply. She walked down the hillside with the sun pressing flat against her shoulders, moving between the goats, who paid her no attention. The cleared section was wider now than when she had first opened the cave door. You could see the real shape of the hill emerging from under the years of vine, the angle of the slope, the layered stone along the upper face, a narrow natural shelf of rock about 2/3 of the way up that ran almost horizontal for 30 feet. Good land, she thought. Real land. Not the worthless tangle the auctioneer had gestured at with one dismissive hand. When she reached the bottom, she went straight to the barn and pulled the coiled pipe out from its corner. It was heavier than she remembered. She dragged it into the light and measured it by eye. Not enough on its own, but combined with the pieces under the feed room floor and the short run of copper she had meant to use for the well repair last spring, it might be close. Close was something to work with. She set the iron coil near the fence post and went inside for the pieces. The barn was still and dim and smelled of hay and dried mud. She pulled up the soft board in the feed room floor and found the pipe sections exactly where she had noted them. 3 lengths, each about 4 feet, a little rusted but solid. She lined them up outside next to the coil and stood back and looked at what she had. The total run came to just over 60 feet when she laid it end to end along the fence line, stepping it off with her boots. The spring was higher than the barn by a good measure, and water runs downhill on its own. That much she did not need to figure. What she needed to figure was the joints. The copper section would not mate cleanly to the iron without something between them, and she turned that problem over in her mind while she walked back to the cave mouth and stood in its cool exhale. The spring ran low but steady from the crack in the back wall, pooling in the carved stone basin, and then finding its way out a channel in the floor that drained toward the hillside. She knelt and put her hand in it again, cold the way deep earth stays cold, regardless of what the sky decides to do. She cupped some and drank. Clean, flat, mineral. The kind of water that had been traveling through stone for longer than the town had a name. She left the cave and walked down to her nearest neighbor's fence line, where she knew he kept a rusted coffee can of odd fittings nailed to a post at the corner of his equipment shed. She had helped him mend pipe twice, years back, and the can had been there both times. She was not sure he would be home. He was not. She stood at the post for a moment, then lifted the can, shook it, listened to the metal clatter of fittings inside. She found 2 that might work, a brass reducer and a short coupling sleeve, and left the rest exactly as she had found them. She would tell him when she saw him. That was not a question in her mind. Back at the barn, she dry-fitted the pieces on the ground, coaxing the coupling between the iron and copper until it seated firmly enough that she could not pull it apart with both hands. The reducer brought the diameter down where the coil ended and the copper began. She tightened the joints with the wrench from the hook by the barn door, each turn slow and deliberate, listening for the sound of thread biting into thread. The goats watched her from the pen fence with their sideways eyes, the way they always watched when she was doing something they had not seen before. The older ones had stopped pressing the fence to be led up the hill. The clearing work was nearly done. In another day, maybe two, there would be nothing left on that slope worth stripping, and the full stone face would stand bare and clean in the heat. She lifted the assembled pipe, tested its weight across her forearms. Tomorrow she would carry it up. Tomorrow she would set the intake at the spring mouth, lay the run down the slope, and find out whether close was actually enough. She carried it up in 2 trips. The pipe sections she bundled under one arm on the first trip, the coil of copper draped over her opposite shoulder, the fittings wrapped in a rag tucked into her coat pocket. The second trip was for the tools, the wrench, a wooden mallet, a folding knife, and a short length of wire she had wound into a tight loop the night before. The morning was already hot by the time she reached the cave entrance, the sun pressing down on the bare stone face of the hillside, with nothing left to filter it. The goats had done their work. What had been a wall of vines so thick a person could not see 3 feet into it was now open slope, the stone gray and clean, the kudzu lying in drying heaps at the base of the hill like shed skin. She stood at the spring mouth first. The water came out of the rock in a steady thread, not dramatic, not rushing, just constant and cold. Cold enough that when she held her hand under it, the chill moved up her wrist and into her arm within seconds. She watched it for a long moment before she touched anything. The drought had not touched it. Whatever fed this spring ran deeper than drought could reach, deeper than the cracked valley floor, deeper than anything the summer heat had managed to pull dry. It had been running here before she was born, and it would be running after her. She set the iron pipe intake against the rock, seating it flush where the water emerged, and drove the wire anchor into a crack in the stone, with the mallet to hold the angle. She worked slowly, fitting each section down the slope, laying the copper coil against the stone where the grade steepened and the run needed to curve. The sun moved while she worked. The fittings held. By the time the coil reached the lower end of the slope and transitioned back to the iron pipe that would carry the water the rest of the way down to the dairy, the sun was full overhead and her shirt was soaked through. She opened the intake. The water moved through the pipe the way water does, without ceremony, without hesitation, filling the iron and copper from the source down to the outlet in one smooth, continuous motion, until it came out the far end in a clear, steady stream. She put her hand under it. Still cold. All that distance, and it came out cold enough to ache. She stood there with her hand under the flow for longer than she needed to, because she wanted to feel it, wanted the chill to move up her arm again the way it had at the spring mouth. Then she straightened, wiped her hands on her trousers, and looked down toward the dairy barn where her herd was waiting in the dry heat of midday. She walked down the slope carrying nothing but the memory of that cold water against her palm, and when she opened the gate to the lower pasture, the herd came toward her, the way animals do when they have been patient past the edge of patience, slowly at first, then all at once, their hooves raising fine dust from the cracked ground. She opened the outlet valve the rest of the way. The trough filled in less than 2 minutes. She had timed it in her head without meaning to. The goats drank with their whole bodies pressed forward, shoulders crowding, and she stood back and let them. The sound of it, that particular sound of animals drinking deeply after a long dry stretch, was the most satisfying thing she had heard in months, maybe longer. The banker came by the next afternoon. She did not go out to meet him. She let him find her at the fence, watching the trough run a slow, steady overflow into the dry ground below it, keeping the earth there dark and soft, while everything beyond the fence line had gone pale and hard. He stood at the gate for a while without speaking. She did not fill the silence for him. Eventually, he said the spring seemed to be holding, and she said it was. He said he'd heard she had brought some wheels to the county market that Saturday. She said she had. He said they moved fast. She said they did. He left without asking anything else. The neighbors came in their own time, some of them, with the particular quietness of people who had been loud before and were now finding a different register. One brought a jar of beans she hadn't asked for. Another stopped along the road and commented on how green her pasture looked compared to his. She agreed that it did. By the end of August, the 44 acres was fenced. Not prettily, but completely, corner to corner, the wire tight and the posts sunk deep. She had paid for it with cheese money, and when she drove the last staple into the last post, she stood inside the boundary of land that was entirely hers and looked down at the valley and up at the cleared hillside and felt the weight of the summer settling into something she could name. The cave sat open behind her, its cut-stone entrance swept clean. The spring ran on inside it, cold and quiet and indifferent to drought, to opinion, to everything that had happened above ground that summer. The goats were already back on the slope, working the new growth that had come up in the cleared places. They were not resting. They never rested for long. She pulled her coat tighter in the early evening cool, watched them move across the hillside in the long last light, and thought, 44 acres, $9. The land had always known what it was worth.